So, Renato, is the Trump administration doing everything it can to prosecute the Minnesota murderer?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal and national security analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a skit. Well, Asha, this is certainly a topic that can't be boiled down. It's so serious, and I would say so over the top that if you told me that this was, about this a week or two ago, I would have thought that this was sort of a plot out of a movie or a bad TV show versus something that actually happened in real life. It's very scary stuff.
Yes. And how many days has it been now? I mean, we're recording this on a Wednesday afternoon. Did it happen over the weekend? It feels like
Yes,
it just kind of.
4 days. 4 days ago, this
Yeah.
was June 14th, I believe, is when the murders happened in the state of Minnesota that we're talking about here of Vance Belter, a apparent right-wing zealot who wanted to target Democratic lawmakers in that state. In a state, by the way, in which there was essentially an evenly divided legislature. And so his decision to target state legislators who are Democrats in that state was calculated. It was calculated to achieve a result, which is, I think, very scary and has scared a lot of people. We'll talk more about that later. I think as a starting point, though, this investigation prosecution has raised a lot of questions, more than it ordinarily would. I think when there are brutal murders, horrific crimes, typically what we're doing is trying to, in many ways, root for law enforcement to find the person who perpetrated them. We always, I think, assume that law enforcement will do everything possible to prosecute that person. I know, when there was a mass shooting close in Highland Park near where I live, of course, it was a combined effort, and no one even seriously questioned that everything possible will be done to prosecute the murderer. Here, though, given the circumstances we're in with the Trump administration, who has pardoned violent insurrectionists who caused deaths, I think there's a lot of questions about and concerns that people have regarding the investigation and prosecution of this particular murderer.
Yeah, when we started to see that the federal prosecutors were going to be involved, I kind of just had this realization of how much things have changed.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden these questions are coming up, and it's sort of like, well, who's going to do the prosecution? Like, let me run and go find, this for me and for you, you're a former federal prosecutor. For me as an FBI agent, I know there are a lot of people who have, aren't always on board with law enforcement and prosecutors. But I think in general, I feel like there has traditionally been a lot of faith in the Department of Justice when it comes to these things. And I want to highlight also just the brutality of these murders and the subterfuge that took place, right? Because this is someone who owned or worked at a security firm. I think he owned it with his wife. And basically was driving a car that looks like a cop car and was dressed in a uniform that made it look like he was law enforcement, and went up to the door, which and the person who opened it thought he was a police officer, and then he basically shot them in cold blood.
Indeed, and just to be clear, he actually identified himself as a police officer when he was knocking on the door, and he then came in to the house, further, held himself out to be a police officer. He was wearing a mask, a flesh-colored mask, to hide his appearance, and that when the victims noticed that there was a mask, and they said, "You're not a police officer." Then he claimed it was a robbery. But there's no question he was holding himself out to be a police officer. In fact, he had a license plate that he had doctored up to say police, a fake looking license plate that if you get close to it looks fake, but from a distance says the word police in big black letters. You would think that meant that he was a police officer. There were sirens on the vehicle. It was a black SUV. It looked like a law enforcement vehicle. And by the way, it was so convincing that there was actually a lawmaker who was saved because local police, when they had heard reports about the first attack, went to her home to provide protection to her. They saw him nearby, and they assumed or believed that was a law enforcement officer. He did not respond when they called out, and they didn't follow up, but which understandable. They were focused on protecting the lawmaker. They saved her life in doing so, but he fooled them at a glance.
Yeah, you mean one of the other targets on his list, because he did have a list of people, and he ended up also going to another home of lawmakers and of a lawmaker, and there was someone who was injured.
Yes. So we have different sets of victims here. We have a murdered couple. We have victims who were shot but are not murdered. And then we have intended targets, right? People, like I said, the another lawmaker who her life was saved because there was local police knew where she
In the
lived,
vicinity.
and they actually went to her home in a proactive way. So kudos to those officers who did that. Noticed an SUV, and there's actually, if you read the federal affidavit supporting the arrest, a federal arrest of the murderer. They actually have photos taken and so you can kind of see how that vehicle and his appearance if you're not really paying attention from a glance could appear like it's law enforcement. But
I mean, all of this gets to premeditate. I mean, it's obvious, this is all planned out, and so this probably translates into legal, what it means legally. At least I know for sure in terms of what they're charging.
That's right. Yeah, I just before we get into any sort of charges or so on, I just do want to mention that you had said a moment ago, Asha, that people have different views about prosecutors, and I agree, and have different views about the criminal justice system. But I think there is a widespread consensus that premeditated murder is something we all condemn, and everyone thinks those people should be completely prosecuted. Mike Lee I don't know, he may make jokes about it. We could talk about that later. But in all seriousness, though, this is the sort of thing no one would think about how the person was charged usually or how they're investigated. Everyone would assume everyone's working together to make that happen. And to just say that, one question here that we can delve into and we could talk about how it usually would work and what the questions are here is, are those charges brought at the federal or state level or both? And how does that work? And that's usually something people don't give a lot of thought about a lot to, because everyone presumes that law enforcement's all working hand in hand to try to ensure that a deadly murderer is going to be behind bars as long as possible.
Right. And I think a good case to reference in this context, I mean, it's a little bit, different factual circumstances, but the Derek Chauvin prosecution, which also took place in Minnesota, there was a state prosecution. There was also a federal prosecution. And yeah, I don't think there was any debate or worry that, but I think it's a good template because in that case, the state did go first.
That's right. And so let's just talk. I want to sort of, before we get into this specific case, just sort of talk about why there is these sort of dual systems and how they usually work, or they're supposed to work, right? So there's
doctrine. It was like one of my favorite things to study in Fed Crim.
Well, it's interesting, right? So usually, even though we think of a lot of times, because there's a lot of TV shows and movies about federal law enforcement, like the FBI and so on, Most law enforcement is at the state and local level, and the police power is generally something that is reserved to the states. The vast majority of crimes that we think about are state crimes. Murder is typically a state crime. Sexual assault and rape and so on is a state crime, not a federal crime, usually. And, I used to, at times, because I unfortunately, was in certain situations, I was a federal prosecutor, but I would joke that if someone tried to murder me, it was a federal crime. But generally speaking, if you're trying to murder people who aren't federal prosecutors, it's a state crime. Okay. Typically, murder is brought as a state charge. So first of all, why do people then, I guess people listening to this might wonder, why do people call for the feds to get involved at all in big cases? And I think it comes down to resources, and it comes down to the expertise and the professionalism and the work product of federal law enforcement. I don't know if you shared that view, Asha.
I mean, I think that is true. And we've talked about that before in other contexts. Remember back in the old days when we used to talk about the indictment in Georgia and things like that.
Right.
But sometimes there are also different federal interests that
Right.
could be implicated. And so, I know people are probably wondering, like, why isn't there double jeopardy if both the state and the federal government were to charge the same crime? And this is the thing that I mentioned before, which is dual sovereignty doctrine, which is the idea that the federal government and the state governments are separate sovereigns. And even if they are charging the same crime, it's not it's not a double jeopardy violation, because they're actually vindicating different interests, and they're kind of operating as completely separate sovereign entities that are vindicating those interests. And so, the federal government, I think here could arguably have an interest in protecting elected lawmakers generally, because that's kind of affects our democratic process. In the Chauvin murder, the federal government also has hate crime legislation that can be utilized in certain cases that are motivated by certain kinds of animus. So yeah, there could be different federal interests. I mean, is what I said, would you agree with that? Would that be a federal interest here, that these are lawmakers? I mean, they're state lawmakers, but I don't know.
Well, I will just say, I guess, generally speaking, there are only limited reasons why somebody might get charged federally with murder. I obviously, given my experience, if for folks who are watching this or listening to it and don't know me as well, I was a federal prosecutor in Chicago for almost a decade. And in this city, there is a concern about violence, and the feds and the state prosecutors work in conjunction with each other, in cooperation, to try to solve problems, and try to achieve goals in order to ensure the safety of the public. And there was definitely a discussion on a regular basis about, in particular cases, were there federal charges, were there state charges, and what would be beneficial. And often the value of the federal charge is what I said, just the quality of the investigation, the quality of the prosecutorial resources, just the amount of resources per case that the feds have, because the state doesn't have the luxury of passing on cases and letting somebody else take them. They have so much more on their plate. Another thing and it can be a state by state thing, you often will be forced to serve more time in federal prison than you might in state. Like in Illinois, it was often the case that you would only serve half the time that you received. So there were people I prosecuted who murdered people, went to state prison, got out, and then committed other crimes. And I would prosecute them for federal crimes that were not murder, but they'd often get more time or similar time for the federal crime.
Yeah, I mean, but those all go to why it might be beneficial for the federal government to prosecute, but they also need a hook.
Correct. Now,
I mean, the federal government can't just waltz in and start prosecuting state murder. So that's what I'm wondering what the federal hook is here. And
in this
it seems like in it seems like in a lot of gang prosecutions, if the gun cross state line, like there's always interstate commerce hook that I think
Right.
can often be met. But
That's
I'm not
that.
sure what is the hook in this case. Where are they kind of hanging their hat?
Well, yeah. So I'll explain that. I will say, by the way, just to bring up back a concept from a prior episode in gang cases, it's often RICO to bring in state crimes as part of some racketeering scheme. So
Yeah.
to think back to our days when we were talking about Georgia state cases, but here it's actually a fairly convoluted way of getting to murder, federal murder here, and here's how. If they first have to charge an underlying federal offense, and that is essentially federal stalking using using various instrumentalities of interstate commerce. So if you read the federal affidavit, they note that SUV he was driving around, I think it was a 2015 Ford Explorer, and they note that none of them were manufactured in the state of Minnesota. Okay, so it's like, okay, so the vehicle he was driving was, he have to be using a firearm so there's that element to it. But then, so stalking, if you read the criminal complaint, stalking of these two individuals is counts 1 and 2. Then counts 3 and 4 is that if there's a statute that says if during and in relation to a crime of violence in which you could be prosecuted in a court of the United States, which here is the stalking, interstate stalking violation, and knowingly and use a firearm, and during the course of that time you caused the death of a person, you could get prosecuted for murder there, and then that's a life imprisonment kind of charge. So that would be the statutory maximum there.
So do you feel like this is a case where normally the feds would have come in so quickly? I mean, I guess that's where my antenna went up, right? I mean, I before talked about the lawmakers being a federal interest. It's definitely a state interest. Like it seems very obvious that the state of Minnesota will want to make clear, like to punish these people, to vindicate its own interests and its own electoral process and officials. I'm just curious whether you think this is just a normal thing, because it felt like, and I know the Minnesota charging process, particularly for first degree murder, which I guess we'll talk about soon, takes a little longer because they do need to go through a grand jury for that. So, but it felt like, I guess the impression, and I think a lot of people on Blue Sky and stuff had this impression that the feds kind of swept in and were eclipsing the states. But maybe this is the normal course of business and we are all just paranoid that there is something nefarious afoot.
By the way, I love that the way you said that. It's like it's like movies and TV shows where the local cops hate the feds.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually neither of those things, ironically. So this is what I would say. In the ordinary course, if a number of random people were murdered in a low-income neighborhood, would the feds take that case? Probably not. And it's just a sad thing, but the truth. However, if Prince was shot and murdered, or if Anthony Edwards, the star Minnesota Timberwolves player, was shot and murdered. I'm trying to think of some of the more famous Minnesota people I could think of off the top of my head.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? Carlos Correa, star shortstop for the Minnesota Twins, is murdered. Someone's targeting the Minnesota.
Kind of off the top of your head, Minnesota celebrity knowledge.
I'm a sports fan, but the point being is, if somebody's going after, in a high profile way, in a very calculated way that draws massive public attention. By the way, you brought up a case in Minnesota that also inspired public attention. The feds will want to get involved. But
that was a civil, that was a clear civil rights kind of violation that they would want to.
That's right.
Prosecute.
But I do think
we're talking about the Derek Chauvin case, just for
that's right. If you just started tuning in,
you just tuned in.
You just tuned in. But the point I'm making is, it operates on multiple levels. I mean, I think one thing that I think is legitimate about that is that part of the goal of the feds is to take the resources that they have and get them the biggest bang for the buck for them, which is why, by the way, celebrities get prosecuted for tax evasion a lot more than random Joe and Jane, Q Public, because they know that if they prosecute Wesley Snipes for tax evasion, people will talk about it. Whereas if they prosecute Asha Rangappa, maybe not. And so they're purposely going to prosecute famous people and try to get bang for their buck. But part of it is also, look, the feds want to, whatever, grab their headlines and show that they're doing things. So there's definitely that element to it.
So you think they would have done this anyway?
Well, I think they would have done it if it was a high profile case that everybody gripped the nation. I
I'm
think
saying
that,
if when I say anyway, if this was not the Trump administration,
right.
would we
I
have
think the Biden
seen?
administration would have done the same thing.
Okay.
That's
All
my
right.
gut on it.
All right.
Now,
People can be
I will
reassured.
say, yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I do know the U.S. attorney, in the acting U.S. attorney that Trump appointed. I did work with him for many years as he was a federal prosecutor in the same office as me before he went to Minnesota. He's a good professional, and the work that's done in the affidavit is strong. But I will say that it'll be interesting to see. I think there are questions about who should go first, and we can talk about that. For example, you could get a lot of the benefits of federal charges by having the feds do all the work up on the investigation, do all the hard work, and then potentially handing some of that off to the state. And I did that. I mean, I investigated, for example, people engaged in child exploitation and abuse and all sorts of serious matters. And ultimately, at times, handed it off to the state because they could prosecute it more directly than we could,
Yeah.
and we would use our resources to assist effectively.
Yeah. It seems like whoever goes first. I mean, is there an advantage? I know the prosecutors who go after are going to be locked into whatever the witnesses say, kind of, or however things unfold in the first one. So there is sort of a certain amount of limiting that happens for the second prosecution. On the other hand, I don't believe Minnesota has a death penalty.
True.
Right?
Feds do,
The
and
feds
the
do, and
prosecutor
apparently
made.
are pretty gung ho about it. Under I thought that was the big platform of theirs, is that they're
Oh
making the
yeah.
death penalty great again, I guess.
And my former colleague, Joe Thompson, mentioned it multiple times at the federal press conference. It's
Yeah.
punishable by life imprisonment or death. It's like, okay. So he was throwing that out there.
Yeah.
Um, I guess
On the other hand,
my
if they prosecute and win, um, get the death penalty, though I would guess there would be a delay before that was determined. But then does that sort of take the wind out of the sail of this? Like, then why are we doing this? Why would the state prosecution even be necessary? Kind of thing. Like, once you've
Mhm. So this is something I've had to deal with in real life on both sides, which is, what do you do when there's someone who's charged in multiple jurisdictions? Okay, whether it's federal and state, you could also have different jurisdictions. I'll give an example. R. Kelly, right? R. Kelly was charged in Chicago, federal and state, and New York and Minnesota all at the same time, because he was criming all over the place, right? So the position in those circumstances. By the way, Donald Trump, right, in a prior many, if you've been watching this podcast and or listening to it for a while, he was charged all over the place. Positioning and timing then become important on both sides, on the defense side and on the prosecution side. I think here the prosecutors would ordinarily be thinking about the following things, right? One is, is there a better chance of victory on one or the other? And that can boil down to also resources, prosecutorial resources, but things about who the jury is going to be and things like that. Okay, and evident, maybe there could be legal differences in terms of what they have to prove in elements and so on. But then secondly, whoever goes first is going to get a conviction, and then the other prosecution is effectively going to be a hammer or something that's dangling over the person's head to get them to plead or give up their
yeah
appeal or whatever. in exchange for something. So there, you have to think to yourself, how do we want that to work out? Do we want to have a federal conviction in which, instead of going through the whole thing again in the state, he ends up giving up in
Yeah.
exchange for something, or the opposite? And that's a strategic decision, although at times, and I'll,
It
rumor
feels
has it
also
in.
like it could be a symbolic decision. And
Mhm.
maybe in the case of, for example, with Derek Chauvin, and here that like the state wants to, kind of like what you said, the feds, like they just want to make a point, like that this is a serious thing. We're gonna, handle
Correct.
it.
Correct. Sometimes it can be something that is not as good. Like there are times, I'm not going to get into specifics, but have been cases where certain prosecutors will feel that another office or another thing, another sovereign is stepping in to grab attention for themselves at the expense of a better case, or, a more appropriate venue. It happens. They have different goals, different interests, and so on. They're different. They have different goals. They're different sovereigns, and so on. They have got their own interests. But I think generally here, Asha, you would be thinking ordinarily purely about, what message does this send to the public, and what is going to ensure that the public is protected from this person for the rest of their lives, that person's life. And so, I will say that ordinarily this wouldn't be a concern, but obviously, and I think you've alluded to it a number of times, people are concerned under this administration, given who the president is and what some of his prior actions are, about the feds going first in this instance.
Yeah, I think that there's the concern is that, and we're going to talk in the next segment about some of the rhetoric that has been surrounding this, that this is not this, at least politically, is being used at like for disinformation and to amplify partisan divides, and in a lot of ways to suggest that um, this is not as serious as it should, that you know we would normally take it. And I think the concern is that this will translate in, because when we are talking about Pam Bondi's Justice Department, these are people who have been very partisan in the way that they have administered justice. I am concerned that either it won't be prosecuted as aggressively, or this coordination with the states won't happen in the way that it normally should, with the kind of comedy and comity, not comedy, but comity that normally would, you would have between the feds and the state, to kind of maybe withhold information. I'm particularly concerned about potentially selective use of evidence to minimize the targeting on a partisan basis, or his political leanings. I mean, there's so much there. And of course, the cherry on top in all of this is that because if it's a federal prosecution, it can also be pardoned. And I hate to actually have to worry about this with a brutal double homicide and attempted murder of others, but here we are, because we know that violence isn't a bar to the current president exercising his pardon power.
That's right. I mean, it's worth noting that people did die in the assault on the Capitol on January 6th. People lost their lives. Trump minimized that. Trump has actually lionized, I would say, or glorified the death of a woman who was storming the Capitol over the deaths of law enforcement officers.
And gave her family a settlement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are good reasons to be concerned about that. I think a more probable concern, or a concern more likely to come into play, is, as you suggested, how much stress is put on the partisan nature of the targeting of this, which I think is particularly aggravating. I mean, the reality is
Yeah.
this individual, whoever you're targeting, and being such a premeditated, brutal, cold-blooded crime, this is sort of thing that would receive life imprisonment, I think, no matter what, I would expect. But that is something that the public should know about and be concerned about. And I think that there are legitimate concerns about the normalization of political violence. And that's really, I think, what you're getting to or hitting on,
Yeah,
Asha, because that's
I
very
think that's
important
a
stuff.
great summary. Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it.
And I think those concerns are legitimate. There's no evidence, I would say, based on what I've seen. I mean, watching the press conferences and the looking at all the charging documents and the statements from law enforcement, I don't have any reason to believe that anyone's pulling any punches or doing anything other than, prosecuting the murderer here to the fullest extent of the law. But those are legitimate concerns, and I think the fact that those concerns are front and center, I think speaks to a problem that we have as a country, a deterioration of our institutions.
Yeah, it's definitely a time of shifting norms, and it's a little bit a reflection of where we are. That this is the first thing that comes to mind, especially when we see a trusted institution or an institution that would have normally, I think, by most people, been trusted fully in this kind of situation.
For sure. Like I said, these questions would not have entered our mind. And that kind of brings us full circle to where we started, which is if there was a brutal murder or premeditated murder of multiple people, the focus would be on finding the murderer, and no one would really be concerned about any lack of effort or diligence in the part of law enforcement in ensuring that that individual was punished to the fullest extent possible.
Well, we'll see. I'm sure we'll be monitoring this case as it goes on.
Indeed.
So, Renato, in the earlier segment, you really hit the nail right on the head where you said what we're worried about is the normalization of political violence. And it's not a worry that's just coming out of nowhere, right? It's not just, oh, because Trump is president, we're worried that the DOJ is going to prosecute it this way. We've seen actual rhetoric that has tried to minimize this crime. And that rhetoric, I mean, we've seen some few problematic statements from Trump, but I think the one that the comments that got the most attention in the aftermath of these murders came from a sitting U.S. Senator, Mike Lee of Utah.
That's right. Usually when there's an act of unspeakable violence, there's almost like a copy and paste of what you expect politicians to say on either side of the aisle, right? I condemn this horrific murder. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the family. Let's pray for law enforcement to, find this perpetrator or whatever it might be. We've all heard those 100 times before. Mike Lee Cho, who's a senator from Utah, who, by the way, early in his career was a critic of Donald Trump's, who's turned into, in many ways, a MAGA influencer.
Yeah, a troll.
Yeah, in many ways. He uses social media. He's got his own based Mike Lee account or whatever that he uses as a troll on formerly Twitter, now X. He posted comments on X essentially suggesting that this is left-wing violence, which on its face is absurd, given that the individual here is not only a registered Republican, but was like deliberately targeting Democrats, Democratic lawmakers to murder them.
Yeah. I mean, you know that I teach about disinformation and misinformation. And it's just one of these things where you can kind of contextualize things any way you want. And from what I understand, I think very early on, like one of the initial reports coming out was that the murderer had no kings flyers or something like that. I don't even know if that's true, but I think like there was some report that came out about that, and then immediately that became the logical leap was, oh, this is a Democrat, and so because I guess he was carrying, like the logic is that he was carrying flyers because he's going to these protests, and then there was another data point about how Governor Walz had appointed him to some bipartisan commission that had like dozens of members that nobody really thinks about, and probably Mike Walz like signs off on recommendations that are given by somebody on his staff, but this became like he's a Walz appointee. And so they just like ran with this. Now, what we know after things have come out is that, as you mentioned, it's not true. And even his neighbors and people who know him have said that he was a very ardent Trump supporter. And this was, him targeting for political reasons, as you mentioned. But that has not stopped the this echo chamber and misinformation, disinformation machine from staying in overdrive. I think Mike Lee's tweet, one of them was "Nightmare on Wall Street" or something like that. It was like
Walls.
Wall Street, who with like a photo of this guy taken at the door, ringing the doorbell, and then the other one was, "This is what happens when you cater to Marxists," or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw this, but I did a quick Blue Sky thread because I think that of course, the tweets are despicable on their face. But I think it's also important for people to know what they are trying to communicate at like a moral, like cognitive level, which is they are trying to basically minimize the harm of this, right? Like first it's a distancing of any responsibility. It's like claiming, well, this is them, it's not us. It's the Democrats, it wasn't a Republican. So, in other words, it's excusing you from having to care. It's using tribal loyalties as a way of saying you don't need to care about this. It's also ascribing blame. Like this is what happens when, these monsters on this side, don't get their way. And there's a dehumanization. And I think it's just really important because this rhetoric can be very dangerous. And I think someone had posted, and I thought this is exactly where I was thinking, who was like, it's like one step from, maybe two steps from this to their cockroaches and snakes, which is kind of the rhetoric that you start getting to when you really start dehumanizing people in a way that encourages violence towards people who are not of your tribe. And that was a reference to Radio Rwanda that did this in Rwanda, that led to the Rwandan genocide. So, I just think we need to be very careful and vigilant, I guess is the word that I'm looking for, when people, especially leaders, start talking in this way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one thing that has caused some serious alarm is that Mike Lee has, at least to my knowledge, you can correct me if I'm wrong, has not come out and said, "Oh, I was very wrong and very apologetic." He put out a statement on his official account saying, thoughts and prayers and all the usual stuff that a politician would say, but he has not basically come forward and say that he made some grave error and he's so regretful and things along those lines, which in another era one would expect if somebody made those sort of despicable remarks.
It also just highlights the disingenuity of some of the claims, that Trump and other Republicans have made. So, for example, when Comey posted the photo that said 8647, and it was like, oh my God, this is a call to assassination or whatever. And it was like it was a seashell, arrangement or something on a beach. You can't claim that something like that is a call for violence and then show like basically zero concern. Trump has refused to call the governor. He says, I don't need to call him. He's a mess. He's a whack job, And so this is signaling. I mean, when you have especially a party that has a sort of cult-like, and it's about loyalty and kind of following signals that are put out by the leaders, Mike Lee, by the way, is not like, I mean, it's bad enough if you have some influencer or, right-wing podcast host, a senator. It's kind of crazy. He has not apologized. He did get confronted, from what I understand, by representatives from Minnesota who, were like, why are you doing this? Like this is really destructive. It causes a lot of pain. Like this is not, like, what are you trying to do? And he hasn't put out a statement on that. He did delete those tweets, though, from what I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I will note he was confronted actually by fellow senators. I think Tina Smith from Minnesota confronted him because her name was on the list too. He started with a sort of a legislature that he could influence the balance of power, but very interesting dynamic there where I think, a lot of members of Congress were understandably concerned about their own safety during the storming of the Capitol. And that's sort of where I do want to talk about it for a moment. I will note that in my own state of Illinois, which is not that far away from Minnesota, there were state legislators this past weekend that said we're not attending events and publicly said that the reason they were not attending events is that they were concerned about their own safety. And I think that ultimately, whether or not someone's successful or not with an attack, whether or not they're in one area or another, having the normalization of political violence can create disincentives, just like we talked about, let's say in the law firm context, disincentivizing people to represent opponents of the administration. Here in this context, it's disincentivizing state politicians, federal politicians from speaking up. Because if you speak up or you oppose the regime, so to speak, supposedly unrelated actors could come and try to commit violence against you.
Well, this was also presumably the fear behind, and I don't know who issued it. I don't know if it came from the governor's office or from local officials, but there was a call put out for people in Minnesota to not go to the No Kings protests that day, because I think it had happened. It was just the night before, and there was a worry but it didn't stop any of the protests. But also, my point is, it has a potential to chill even First Amendment activity by ordinary people.
Yeah, and I will just say for anyone who's watching this or listening to this and is critical of the effect it has, whether it's on a protester or on a lawmaker, it is one thing to theoretically understand that someone could harm you. It's another thing to be in a situation where you genuinely are afraid for your own life. I mean, I have been in situations where people threatened my life when I was and I had to go to protective custody and things like that. It is a serious, life-altering matter when you're in those situations. And obviously, lawmakers in different states, it's not quite the same way. But the bottom line is as this becomes more prevalent, there will be a chilling effect because people understandably don't want to risk their lives just to make a political statement. And that's just the reality of things. And if we care about a democracy in which people's voices are heard, in which a variety of views can be heard, in which we're truly free, then we need to be concerned about the rise in political violence or the normalization of political violence.
Yeah, 100%. I was just going to say there's just no place for it in a democracy that, functions and believes in peaceful means of resolving things. And I would hope that that's something that we could all agree on.
Yeah, I hope so. So, Asha, I have been watching the NBA Finals. It's taken a turn against the Indiana Pacers. And you probably don't even know what the Pacers are because I have
They're from
learned
Oklahoma.
that's the Indiana team, actually.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
and that is just the perfect reveal of the fact that maybe you were not entirely forthcoming last week during our pop quiz.
Yeah, I was getting some assistance.
Yeah, I kind of figured. It
I
is,
came clean right after we finished, and
I
then you
know.
got really mad.
I was not happy because I thought I had gotten you on that one. But look, it is, it's one thing that is kind of interesting, I will say, is that sports remain one of the few things that kind of bring everyone together in this country. It's one of the few things that I think everyone can enjoy and talk about and think about in a completely nonpartisan way. I wish that that topic was, and other topics like that one, were the way that the rest everything else was nowadays.
Yeah, no, it's true. I would say sports, I think, I actually teach about this, about areas where people come together across cleavages that ordinarily divide us, right? So, and where those particular divisions don't matter. Sports is one of them, right? I mean, when you're all on the same team, you don't really care who you voted for. You don't care, race and religion and all that stuff. That's not what you're bonded and on the same team, and rooting for your team. Although it's interesting, even sports can be politicized, and we saw that like what 5 or 6 years ago with the kneeling, whatever, and football games and stuff. So that became a political issue, and kind of was trying to force people to um, choose political sides, I guess, using sports as a forum. So I don't think it's immune, but it is, I think, much more resilient, because I would say the arts also, where people can come together, and you're because you're enjoying something together, right? You're all united in some common endeavor, which I agree with you, we don't do enough of in our society.
Right. Oh, it's interesting. I mean, sometimes it's politicized. Like in the example you gave, Trump was politicizing football. It can be also politicized in a way that's more affirmative, where you had like the NBA had everyone wearing Black Lives Matter shirts and really talking about the danger that Black people in the United States feel with law enforcement, and making that front and center at their games for during during the time where there's so many protests around the same time as the pandemic. So, I guess all I would just say is that I'm hopeful that some of those things can potentially be a bridge that can lead us to a little bit of a better spot after this
Yeah,
presidency.
even the arts can get politicized. Trump and JD Vance got booed at the Kennedy Center,
Well, they've
like
kind
last week.
of done their part to politicize the Kennedy Center, didn't they? I mean, that's part of it, right?
Yeah,
Basically going to war against that institution.
yeah. Well, let's hope that some of these arenas we can keep intact. And yes, you caught me. I was cheating last week. I feel like I was not trying to hide that from you. I did hide that from our viewer. I think I was pretty obvious. I think I might have even said I'm getting some assistance. You all know me. Come on.
This
Why
seems
would
like
I know? Why would I know
disinformation.
who is playing in the NBA Finals?
This is disinformation. But I am proud of out investigating the investigator.
Yeah, it was subterfuge. All right, I won't. I'll just be very honest about my sports ignorance from now on.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.